Hi there, I'm Tom Field. I'm Senior Vice President of Editorial with Information Security Media Group. We're pleased to welcome you to today's session entitled Your Roadmap for OT Cybersecurity, 5 Critical Controls for Implementing a Successful Security Posture. Panelists today include Jason D. Christopher, Director of Cyber Risk at Dragos, and Sam Van Ryder, who is Director of Strategic Accounts at Dragos. Now, before I bring them on the screen, let me give you some background on our session today. It is easy to get overwhelmed when you think about the importance of building an OT cybersecurity program, especially if you don't have those resources already in place. But no matter where you are in your journey, you want to learn more how to assess your OT cybersecurity maturity and build a roadmap to a sustainable OT cyber program. This is the webinar for you. We're going to discuss the importance of understanding where you are currently and what a bad day for your organization looks like, how to build and align the people, processes, and technology in your ICS-OT environment with the 5 critical controls for effective OT cybersecurity. A little bit of background on my organization. Information Security Media Group is a global education and intelligence firm. We're 16 years old and based in Princeton, New Jersey in the US. You may know us, of course, by one or more of our 34 media properties. These include Bank Info Security, Gov Info Security, and Data Breach Today. In all, we reach an audience of over 1 million security leaders globally, and we give them a daily diet of news, analysis, research, events, and educational programs just like this one. A few notes of housekeeping. If you have any questions for our panel, you can submit them anytime via the chat window on your screen. I likely can't get to every question, but for those that we don't answer today, we will get a response back to you via email. Should you encounter technical issues while viewing today's webinar, please take down the email address you see on your screen. If you write to webinars@ismg.io, we've got support staff standing by to help. Also, a reminder, today's webinar is copyrighted material. It's meant for today's session and individual study purposes only. If you'd like to use any of the information covered today, or if you're looking for customized training materials, please contact us. Delighted to introduce our sponsor today. In a world of rising cybersecurity threats, Dragos protects the most critical infrastructure, those that provide us with the tenets of modern civilization, from increasingly capable adversaries who wish to do it harm. Devoted to codifying and sharing their in-depth industry knowledge of ICS and OT systems, Dragos arms industrial defenders around the world with the knowledge and tools to protect their systems as effectively and efficiently as possible. Let's meet our speakers. Jason D. Christopher leads the risk management global service, focusing on innovative approaches for decision makers and executives by blending traditional risk engineering approaches with state-of-the-art technology and services across the company's product catalog. With over 15 years of experience in cybersecurity and industrial control systems, he offers critical infrastructure expertise in developing successful cyber risk strategies. Sam Van Ryder started his career in mechanical engineering. He's accumulated over 20 years of experience in sales, including 15 focused on industrial control system security specifically. He's led the energy team for Tripwire, where he worked to build the non-intrusive and highly robust security option and operational environments for energy verticals impacted by NERC SIP. He's the co-founder of USecCom and served as board member of the country's largest InfraGard chapter in Houston. With that, let's bring on board here Sam Van Ryder and Jason D. Christopher. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks for having us.
So we'll start here. I think many of us have got familiarity with Dragos, but Sam, tell us a little bit more about who Dragos is, what you're doing, and how you've evolved over the past year or so in light of the threat landscape.
Sure, absolutely. Let me go ahead and throw up a slide here just from a quick overview on what Dragos is and who we are. We were founded back in 2016, and we're a global organization now. We've had a humongous amount of growth since that time frame, and we're up to almost 550 people now across the globe. But we are focused purely on industrial and critical infrastructure, right? So anything that is, whether, we're widely spread in utilities and oil and gas and chemical, in pharma and manufacturing of different sorts, food and bev, things like that. So we're really focused on what the core assets and core business is for our customers, which is exactly these industrial environments. So if you're not pulling oil out of the ground, you're not making money. If you don't have, have that electricity flowing to your customers, you're not making money. And so these are things that are our pure focus, and it's really in different areas of the business for us. We're very community focused, so we talk about that safeguard civilization. That's not just a tagline; it's a lot of focus you'll see across organization and people. So all of this is centered around our platform, which is a technology that we have that's monitoring these environments and looking for asset discovery. It's doing vulnerability management. It's doing threat detection that's driven by things like our threat intelligence. So we have a whole group that monitors what adversaries are doing out there and are making sure our customers are aware of it. But that information actually ties into our threat detection. So we're doing threat detections a little differently than your traditional signature approach. Then we have services on that side too, which expand everything from training to response retainers, to architecture reviews and all these other services to help our customers start down the journey, which I know we'll get to. But a lot of that information too that they're learning out in the field is we have an incident response team. They bring that back and help develop the threat detections. They help develop our case management. So being able to do playbooks throughout the system when we do have incidents. And then we have teams that are monitoring our customer systems with OT Watch, which is another offering on that. And then based on that too, a lot of this information feeds out to things for community defense, which is around our Neighborhood Keeper program, which is a very unique way of doing an anonymous sharing of information to make sure that everybody can collaborate when new threats do arise. And that's really Dragos in a nutshell.
No, that's an excellent overview, Sam. Let's talk about this relationship between OT and IT. It's more critical than ever. Why?
Well, I think for years now, we've been pontificating about it. And finally, over the past probably half dozen or so years, we're seeing a lot more exposure in the boardroom of asking, how are we doing? And traditionally the CISO would come back and report, hey, we're doing great. Our risk is, we're in an acceptable risk level, et cetera, et cetera. But they've never really specifically called out the industrial side of the house. If you're a board member, you assume if the CISO or CIO is coming to you, they are talking about all of it. And that traditionally just hasn't been the case because they haven't necessarily had access or the collaboration between the two. There's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's political. Sometimes it's that IT guy that came in with a scanner and took down a few PLCs in an environment and bricked the plant. So things like that happen in the past, but we're getting smarter about it. We're getting better at it. And people and the boards and C-levels are now realizing that this is something that has to happen, that has to be included as part of the overall strategy. And the challenge to that is we've been doing IT security for 20 plus years. We have to catch up. So OT has been behind, and now we're trying to catch up to all these things. And because these systems aren't designed the same way IT systems are, we're not replacing them every few years. We're not patching them every time we see something come up. It's longer. It takes longer. If the system's working, there's no reason to touch it. And so this is something that creates somewhat of a cultural divide between IT and OT. And it's really important for us to really bring the two together and get better at communicating with each other. And then oftentimes we jokingly call it marriage counseling in Dragos when we try to help decipher, everyone's got the similar goals. The goals aren't separate. It's just a matter of they talk about them differently. And then it's really a big part of what we do too is help these folks come together.
I think actually building on that, Sam, too, the idea that we've heard a lot over the past decade or so, probably 2 decades-ish, has been convergence, right? Convergence of IT and OT. And a lot of folks have said, well, it's coming. And it's here. It's a decade old. It's been here for a really long time. If you walk into a control center, you'll see a lot of IT-like equipment. And unfortunately, while you'd think that would make this easier, it makes it more difficult because a traditional person coming from enterprise IT will walk into control center and say, oh, I've seen this all before. I can secure this. I'll just run some active scans and, let me just go ahead and put in a patch management program in here. And that would wreck what we're doing on the OT side because those systems are more deterministic in nature. When they see a 0 or a 1, it means for them, open a lever, open a valve, right? It doesn't mean a data sort of transfer that would be happening. It's actually impacting the physical world. So when something floods a network or when there's a new patch that may shut down a service that you depend on, you can actually have not only an operational outage, but you can have a safety event. And that cultural divide then hits those people really fast in the face when they think they know the technology, but there's a whole physics that is the background that really needs to be understood before you can even get to the security problem.
So, John, we acknowledge that OT is so vital, but given that it's so vital, why has it been a neglected partner for so long?
It's been visibility, frankly. When we talk about that CISO problem, right? So you give a CISO a budget, you tell them to secure things, they're going to secure what they know. And they're going to know enterprise really well. If you talk to a CISO of how they even had visibility of the security problem in OT, they don't even think they own it in some cases. They think maybe the VP of engineering owns it. And the VP of engineering may not think that they own it. They may, well, what do you mean? You secure the networks. I'm using a network, therefore I'm secure, right? And so it's really been like ships passing in the night. They're not communicating for the longest time. And now all of a sudden we really have to. Whether it's been sort of in the electric sector, the increased regulations from NERC-CIP, most recently the Colonial Pipeline in oil and natural gas. These events have now made it so that you really have to understand security as a whole approach across both of them versus, well, who's on first? Hey, I gave you budget for security. Yeah, but that doesn't cover my PLCs. Is no longer a debate. You actually all have to come to the table at the same time and hash those discussions out as opposed to waiting for it to happen.
Sam, you care to add to that?
No, I mean, it's exactly that. And we also think about, because they've worked in their silos for so long, and to JD's point, there's just been that build of culture. If you walk out to a plant, I live in Houston, Texas, you walk out to one of the plants in Baytown, people are different than the ones you're going to find downtown in the back office, working on the data centers and things like that, right? So there's a lot to be said for going out and taking people out for tacos and beer and getting to know their cultures and getting aligned with some of that, as JD was talking, or as Jason was talking about. So it's solvable. I mean, that's the good news. It's a question, but it takes effort and it takes time. So the big thing here is oftentimes we get into situations where people are trying to push goals through in a very short time window, and it's just not necessarily feasible. So it's, there's a lot of different ways to start, and I know we're going to talk about some of those. But at the same time, we just have to be sensitive to the fact that this isn't something that's going to happen overnight.
Very good. Jason, we've heard about critical controls in IT, certainly, but for OT, for this discussion, we have only 5. Why is that?
So it's really interesting. Whenever you'll talk to most offenders, if they're, sort of been, I don't want to say brainwashed, but it's almost the terminology I want to use to discuss how we've talked about how to secure these systems, you'll hear people say things like, well, I have to be right all the time, and the attacker only needs to be right once. And what they fail to acknowledge is you have a home field advantage. As a former asset owner operator, I knew my systems better than somebody who would have to live off the land for maybe months or years to get the same level of knowledge that I already have. So a slip up on their end was something that if I had the visibility and had the detection, ostensibly I would be able to find. So instead of really spreading around a larger set of controls, whether we're talking about the critical 20 or now, the critical X, or if we're talking about, the hundreds that you may see if you pull up a NIST document, or even standards that I really love and have been a part of, like the ISA 62443 standards, a lot of that could be overwhelming. And 9 times out of 10, when we're working with a client, it really comes down to just tell me what to do. I'm exhausted, and being able to talk about it. Well, these are the ones that we know from looking at all the adversaries, from looking at all the architectures that we've been able to see over the past number of years. Here are the real ones that will help you get to that risk reduction in a really sort of effective manner. It doesn't mean that these 5 are like the be all end all, but they are the greatest way to be able to talk about your journey and start your journey. And then as you get more mature, sure, you can start talking about looping in the hundreds of other controls that are out there, but really understanding what are those threats and how to make an architecture based off of that. And then closing those gaps is really the key part of the journey that we want folks to focus on.
Beautiful. You called these up here. Let's talk about each of the 5, the fabulous 5 here, starting with an ICS specific incident response plan. Please, Jason, walk us through these 5.
So unfortunately, we find most folks will say they have a response plan if they say they have one. Sometimes they'll be honest and be like, I don't know what's going to happen. Like, I don't know what a bad day looks like. I don't know what's going to happen when that does. But if they do say they have one and you just poke a little bit, you'll find out it's something that's based off the enterprise. And they'll talk about maybe how to take care of enterprise assets and systems, and not realizing that when we're talking about things that are happening at the plant, for example, it's going to be, the Bob, the engineer, the Alice, the operators of the world who are responding, not somebody from IT coming in and doing that response with them. And even in the cases where they are they trained to operate at that facility? They know what the threats would look like. And even if they know that, at a certain point, they're not restoring the system like they would in an enterprise IT area. They have to go rely on the engineer and the operator to do a plant startup and get things restored. So when we talk about item number one, there's two real big things here. One, do you know what a bad day looks like? And could you respond and recover from that bad day? That's one of the key elements. But the other key element is, what are the scenarios you really care about? What are the scenarios that would drive that incident response plan? So just don't say, hey, we have a call number. Do you know what this looks like for, let's say, ransomware in your OT environment versus a very specific nation state that is targeting your sector in your geography that could possibly have an impact in your operations? Those responses will look very, very different. And as a result, you want to make sure that you have something tailored to that, which leads beautifully into number two, a defensible architecture. Because what most people don't realize is that defensible architecture should be based on the scenarios you care about. The things that you care about in the real world, maybe it's ransomware. And let's say for a defensible architecture, there are a set of, if I look at like the big list of controls that are already out there, maybe there's a set of 20 things, 50 things that you should really care about when you make a defensible architecture. Where are your firewalls? Where's your placement for some of the things like visibility and detection? But if you're worried about maybe a nation state adversary, maybe you're worried about one of the actors that we track at Dragos, like Xenotime, then maybe it's not 50. Maybe it's more like 75 or 150. And those sort of controls that could build out from that perspective, and that defensible architecture, what makes defense be defensible, those things could change based off of item number one. What do you care about for that really bad day? So tailoring your defenses based off of what are the scenarios you care about can make it more cost effective for you to actually get to defensible architecture, as opposed to laying down, here's NIST 882, do everything inside of this. That's exhausting. So 1 and 2 really tie well together there. And as I get through it, then I'll get right into 3. If a tree falls in the forest and no one's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound. That is what we mean by security monitoring. If you're not detecting the things that are the scenarios that you just said in number 1 that you care about, that you then built the defensible architecture to take care of, how would you know if the defenses fail unless you're doing some sort of security monitoring? And unfortunately, this is one of the ones where we see a lot of folks just not doing it currently in the industry. There are a lot of folks who are, but maybe they're doing it at a site or two when they have hundreds of sites. And that could be a really big problem if we think about systemic risks and systemic sort of attack vectors where they can get to multiple places at the same time. If you're not looking, how would you know? And you really have to think about how quickly could you respond and recover if you knew sooner, building into that third control. And then 4 is really like, let's just like take care of some of the things that we already know are really bad, like remote access and having things like multi-factor authentication when using remote access. During the times that we've lived in so far with COVID, we saw an explosion of what I would call less planful remote access. A lot of vendors are saying, hey, I'll give you a remote access program for free during COVID, and it helps you from a response sort of operational capability. I don't have to bring somebody out to a site, but it was no longer planful with working with security, figuring out what are the right provisions that need to be in place, who needs access to this remote access solution. And we saw an explosion of remote access across the board. So really, this control is just calling out, can you please just make sure that you have additional controls with remote access? If somebody is able to access your plant from their phone, can you make sure at the very least that there are multiple layers of authentication before they get there? And then the last one, key, and I like the word here, key vulnerability management program. This is one of the ones that blows most people's minds when they come from IT enterprise into OT. There are just some things that I will never patch when I'm in an OT environment. Some things I can schedule a patch for, maybe when there's a plant maintenance cycle, but we're not going to run patch Tuesdays. We're not going to have sort of a regular schedule for a lot of this. We may have to look for ultimate modes of being able to deal with vulnerability management that aren't just talking about patching. So understanding what are those critical assets, what are the real sort of vulnerabilities that we care about in those critical assets, and what are the ones that I can deal with that won't impact operations, and then have a schedule for things that may come down the line. if you put these 5 together, they tell this story about understanding your really bad day, understanding your assets that you really want to defend, put the right defenses in place, look for the bad day happening, and then start cutting out where it is that most of the vulnerabilities and most of the attack vectors come from, either through secure remote access or having some sort of vulnerability management program in place.
Jason, devil's advocate here. I appreciate what you've shared here. Put myself in the position of our attendees. Once I start down the path of these critical controls, 1, how do I make sure they work? 2, how do I measure their success?
Oh, I love metrics. So I'll say that it's really a 2-part discussion. One is what you just said with how do I know that it works? And that is a sticky topic that I find most security people, not even like IT versus OT, but most security people like to shy away from, which is the dreaded word of oversight or compliance, right? Nobody wants to think about like what that compliance mechanism or oversight mechanism would look like, but every governance structure has one. It's one of the things whenever I talk to a CISO and they say, oh, I don't want to inform my auditors of what I'm doing. And I'm like, but that's what the CFO does. And you constantly talk about wanting to be invited to the big kids table as an executive, as a chief. You have to embrace compliance. It's part of our culture. I don't want you to think that security is this weird thing because it's over there. So really using the same mechanisms that we would have across the board from an executive suite, run regular assessments, be able to make sure. And that's actually one of the things that's been built more into regulations recently has been, do you have an assessment plan? How often do you go out and assess, and what type of assessments do you run? Are you just running architecture reviews, or are you running sort of purple teaming where you have a red team and blue team coming at the same time, double checking what your vulnerability management program is? Were they able to get through secure remote access? Like there's different journeys you can go along the way to understand all 5 of those critical controls with a great assessment program. So absolutely, highly recommend at the very least annually being able to go through those assessment programs. Now, metrics within OT are really sticky because we don't have as many automated tools to look for measurement as you would in the IT environment. So sometimes it may be actual manual things like, hey, can we just look at logs? And you may not find a log aggregator. You may not find a way to be able to do this automatically. So you may have to do a lot of manual shuffle. What I encourage people to do if it's their first time through a metrics program, maybe just even ask, what's our visibility? Is it 0% or 100%? Start measuring small successes before you can get into a more robust metrics program like I'd expect to see in an enterprise IT program, and then slowly start talking about your story, about what it is that you want to see improvements on over that time period.
Excellent. Sam, I'm going to come back to you and see if you got anything you want to add to what Jason's just shared with us.
No, I think I mean there's a lot there, right? And I think there's always a risk of when oftentimes what I'll hear is, hey, you know, a lot of folks that I know from the IT side know the whole SANS top 20 critical security controls. And actually, Jason and I were talking about this the other day. I mean, you can really unpack that and go down rabbit holes, right? So we can look, especially like with vulnerability management, it can look very daunting. And that's why we took the step back and say, hey, look, most of the folks we're talking to are very early in their journey. You're not going to get, you eat an elephant 1 bite at a time. Let's give them that starting point, right? And that's the whole idea behind these controls here that we're doing. As you mature and get better, will you add more? Will we suggest more? Absolutely. And as we engage and we see, you know, deltas in your maturity program, then we'll make suggestions on what things you could be doing next. But it's very hard when you're just starting out on the journey on where exactly you start, right?
Keyword journey. Go ahead, Jason.
I was just saying that whole idea that, you know, does this change over time? It has me thinking about our year in review. And, you know, for the first couple of years, the year in review statistics were based off of where it is that we've seen clients in their journey. And it's always their starting point. So we'd always be able to say things like, oh, nobody could detect us in the environment. Oh, nobody had like really an incident response program. But now we're revisiting those clients after they've been on this journey now for multiple years of the life cycle of being here with Dragos. And now we're saying, oh, you can see us. Oh, you do have an incident response program. So now that you have those things, what should you do next? And that means that OT security is going to look radically different from where we are today compared to where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years for sure.
I'll come back to the word journey. How do you tie these critical controls to the roadmap, to your journey?
Baby steps. So it's absolutely figure out that starting point. We'll work with a lot of clients, and I think that Sam had a really good phrasing early on about culture. And the way that I think about culture is it eats strategy for breakfast, right? It doesn't matter how much I put into place from a strategic perspective or technologies. I could buy all the right tools. I could put all the policy documents in place, but if I don't have the right culture to support it, it'll fail. And so a lot of the clients that we work with, one of the reasons that they start off maybe with a site or two, or they'll do an architecture review at all plant, is because they know they've got champions at that one plant. They know that they've got somebody that is really excited about OT security, and they just want to be able to show progress. And so sometimes the very first year is, can you just see what good looks like? And if you've got the right champion in place who maybe does security, not because they've been trained in it, but because they think it's the right thing to do, and you bring in, somebody like our services team, or you bring in a platform that has an installation that has a lot of support behind it, then you can start seeing what impacts you could have at a broader scale. And then maybe you'll roll out to additional sites because you've seen the success. So, Sam's absolutely right. You eat that elephant one bite at a time, just get that ball rolling. And that's when we start seeing a lot more of that culture impact, because they can start seeing where the benefits come from, as opposed to, oh, we're going to tomorrow, go ahead and do an architecture review across 500 sites. That probably isn't going to happen. But if you can get to the right champions and align with them, and then build that culture, show those easy wins first, then you'll start seeing a more programmatic improvement that comes as a result.
Last question I have for you, gentlemen, for both you and Sam and Jason. What do you see when industrial organizations put in vulnerability management?
Oh, Sam, start with that one.
Well, first I think the first, let me start for those that are watching that are IT centric, right? When you think of vulnerability scanning, there's a lot there. And there's a scoring system, the CVSS scoring system, that was built around IT assets, and it was built for IT. That is probably one of the biggest challenges. And what we did is we went back and we re-rated all these things. We had a bunch of smart folks here that went through all the CVSS scoring to rate them to what we think is more appropriate. As we kind of alluded to before, and Jason talked to earlier, you're not going to patch everything. So, our level now is not coming in and saying you're getting 1,000 critical scans, because you are probably do have Windows 7 server, Windows 7 devices somewhere in that environment, and they're working just fine. And they may even have malware on them, and they're running, but they're entirely segmented off and they don't touch anything else. So don't touch it. It's working. And so we re-rated them to say, hey, look, basically, now never, or now never next, essentially, from a rating perspective, so we can give you a better idea of what things are really important. Obviously, it ties back to what Jason was talking earlier. What does good look like? And you got to start there. But from a vulnerability management perspective, that can be very daunting when you think about it, just because if anybody's ever done an IT vulnerability scan, you know what you're in for coming back from that scan, and trying to weed through what that result is.
And I'd go that one step further, because the vulnerability is one thing, right? And convincing somebody like, hey, there's an operational risk, and that operational risk will far outweigh any security benefits we get. That's a discussion. It's a hard one for folks to wrap their mind around. But what I'll even point to things that'll blow some IT enterprise folks' minds even further is there'll be several times where I could walk out to a generation facility or another type of plant, chemical facility, and see Configure. Just some great, some circa early 2000s slammer. I can find this sort of commoditized IT-centric malware running wild in the OT plan, and an IT security person will come in and be like, "Oh, we have to haul out everything. We have to be able to flash back to something, or I at least need to be able to quarantine this." And everybody, my number one thing is, don't just stop. And you're not going to address this until the next maintenance cycle for the plant, which may be 3 months from now. And it's a struggle. I see it every single time. You see like their face like just starts turning a shade of red, and they get like really concerned about, why is it am I letting malware run wild? I'm like, well, is it operating anything? Is it going to cause a lack of operations? Is it going to impact safety? And if you could have that meaningful assessment and show them that no, it won't. Maybe it's causing some network traffic issues. That could lead to an issue, possibly, depending on the equipment on there. But most of the time it doesn't. And so in those cases, we say, just let it run. If it's not impacting operations, you do have a bad day, right? Somebody plugged in something or clicked on something they should not have. So you do have to do an investigation. You have to be able to say, hey, this is the culture of security you want to get to, but you're not doing an incident response that you would expect to see in an IT enterprise. And that is something that they struggle with. And so it leads back to vulnerability management the same way. I'll respond very differently, and therefore I'll have to look at things differently, including vulnerabilities. So it's a struggle to get people to get trained up originally. And once they do, though, they're great. Like once somebody understands that physics takes over and engineering takes over, it's actually a very easy conversation for an IT person to come in and understand that, and then really get part of what this journey looks like from there.
Very good. Jason, Sam, it's been an excellent discussion. I appreciate your insight. We do have some questions from the audience if you want to take some now.
Absolutely.
Reminder to our attendees, if you have questions, you've not submitted them, you still can. We won't get to every question today, but for those questions we don't answer in today's session, we'll get responses back to you via email. First question I have, gentlemen, are there any threat trends you've noticed you want to bring to our attention now for ICS and OT?
I'll start with
Jason. I'll let you take that.
Yeah,
You take.
I think we could probably tag team this a little bit. So, one of the ones that is definitely, I would say, it's not even sparking interest. It concerns me the most is when I start seeing the attackers go after safety systems. And so really seeing some of the key reports that came out of Xenotime and a couple of other sort of attack groups that aren't just looking at, disruption of operations to be able to bring down a power plant or a substation, but to actually cause harm to human beings when they target our safety systems, which for us as engineers, when we arrive on site, we just assume that that's in place. It's a safety net. And when someone's going after that, it means that they're not just trying to get to the loss of operations. They're trying to not just destroy necessarily the equipment itself, but also loss of human life, loss of limb. That is one of the all-time scariest things for me. It's one of the ones that I really wish that we would be able to, as an industry, come behind and say, hey, maybe those things shouldn't be connected. Maybe we need to look at more passive safety elements and some more analog solutions in place, as opposed to some of the whiz-bang things that some vendors are doing, where they're bringing safety and control all in one box in one system at the same time. That just makes it easier for the attacker. So there's this sort of new discussion that I think is happening that is great to see defenders embrace, but worrisome from an attack perspective for sure. I could add more, Sam, if you want me to add more.
I was, for me, I mean, what I still see a lot of, and it's really cross industry, is there's still the threat of ransomware, and we're still seeing a lot of that specifically, right? And I know it's kind of cooled down a little bit. Our threat advisory came out here recently about, we're seeing a little bit of a lull, but we're expecting more, we're predicting more. So that's going to continue to be there. There's a lot of dynamics there too, based on what our intel folks are researching and watching, everything from global political issues to just plain old bad guys doing bad things, right? And but between that, I mean, and those vectors too of just insider error, right? And I'll call it error because it's not always a threat necessarily. Somebody could have done something really dumb and inadvertently, totally, and it could have caused a chain of events. So some of that too is that's not your traditional hoodie hacker type thing necessarily, but there's certainly things that can impact a plant and a production, whatever that may be.
That's actually another sort of key interesting one is when you mentioned ransomware, Sam, just got me thinking about what I call like the IT/OT middleware. Like there are some things that IT and OT both rely on. Like let's say you want to get plant data out of the plant into the corporate network. There's typically some sort of system that may lay in between. And when you see things where like the Colonial Pipeline incident, where it was IT based, but it led to operations, a lot of folks sort of said, well, why would that be? And it's because, again, you don't necessarily, in a lot of cases, know what all those systems look like. And so it goes back to critical control number one. Do you know what a bad day looks like? And that's inclusive of, can your IT systems impact your OT systems? If yes, then those are now part of your crown jewels that you also want to defend, because that can lead to that bad day.
Well said. A few more questions I want to get through here. Here's one. If I'm a small to mid-sized business or resource constrained, how do I build a cyber program, and are there resources for me? I believe the answer is yes.
Yeah, and I'd be happy to jump in there. So I would direct any of those folks to our website. There is a huge amount of resources that you don't have to register for or anything. Anytime you go to any of our stuff, you see that little skip button down there if you don't want to register. But we have a ton of information from white papers and blogs, other webinars, things like that. But there's a lot of data out there that we share. And that's like a primary point. There's so much data that's already there. Some of the other things is, get involved in your community, right? I mean, get if you've got a local InfraGard chapter or something of that nature, right? Or you have other industry specific communities, get involved there and ask questions, right? There are a lot of people that want to talk to you and they'd love to share the information. But those are two of the things that I would say are top of mind for me when it comes to an SMB that doesn't have the resources to try to get started on this.
And one thing I've then point them to is actually on our website is a page called OT Cert. That is a resource that we created that is for specifically, I mean, it's for everybody, but we have resources that are geared towards small businesses as well. One of the things that's definitely the struggle there is you may not even have a full-time employee who does cybersecurity. I've worked a lot, for example, with municipalities that, you know, the best I could describe it is maybe like 0.2 FTE full-time employees that are working on security. And they may be working on IT security and just sort of understanding OT security is a thing. For those folks, just being able to run even on OT Cert right now, we've got a very simple assessment. Just a handful of questions of, can you answer this? And if you answer no, then that tells you what the next thing you should do is. Surprise, surprise, they also align to the 5 critical controls, but they will get you sort of geared up and ready. And the other thing I'll say is, you know, outside of some of the programs that we run, like sort of the community defense program, I'd also look at folks to be able to talk about training. If I have $1 to spend, I would want to spend it on getting somebody trained up, either with free resources or being able to get through a paid class, because once they're trained, they'll then be able to tell you what you should improve upon. And so that's really the gear that I want people to start going towards, so they have a better understanding of what maybe their gaps are and how to close them.
Next question I have for you. Am I less at risk if my organization still has air-gapped technology?
What flavor of air gap?
Oh.
We love that. We love the air gap discussion, right? So, look, the reality is the air gap does mean different things to different people, unfortunately, right. And it's usually not real. And so I've yet to see anywhere that doesn't have some sort of ingress egress point. And as we move into things like digital transformation projects and stuff like that, that's going to get worse. Because we need access to those systems, we need access to that information, and so the reality is you're not going to protect yourself. And even if you do, the question is, is it risk over growth, over innovation? Is that what it is? Is that your question, right? I mean, that's kind of something you got to talk to to understand yourself as well. Jason, I don't know if you have more to add to that.
Sure. No, I would echo that. I have definitely walked onto sites where they told me there was an air gap, and I've walked out of sites with people just realizing they don't have an air gap. That unfortunately happens way too often, and it's because they've been told it, or they trace down X amount of lines and they believe it to be true. It's not like with any malcontent that they don't know that they have one. It's just that it turns out the vendor has a persistent connection, or there's a contractor who, even if it's air gapped, if they arrive on site, they all of a sudden just hook it up to their work laptop, and then it's all of a sudden not, because that work laptop is actually pinging out, right? So there's a lot of sort of misconstrued truths about that air gap. And so one of the things that I would just encourage people to do is do those assessments, right? Do that sanity check at the very least, just so that you can be confident in that. To Sam's point, though, if it's air gap today, it will not be air gap tomorrow. We've seen way too many organizations start going towards digital transformation, and not for wrong reasons, right? It's always for good economic reasons, that the business wants to be able to drive more efficiencies, keep down downtime, do more automation. Those are good things to embrace. What we need to do as security professionals is not say no to those things. What we need to do is say, yes, but. Yes, but here's how we secure it. And too often we're left in the dark, and we don't come to those discussions till way late in the life cycle of digital transformation in particular. The more that we can get involved early on and get to yes, but, the easier our lives will all be in the future. And I think that's what we're really gearing for.
Great. 2 more questions I want to try to get in here. First, how do you use threat intelligence to inform a defensible architecture?
Oh, I love this. So, and I love this because I always try to drive in the threat intelligence discussion when I talk about requirements. When everybody talks to me about what requirements they need for that defensible architecture, I like to say, but why? So I did yes, but before, now I'll do but why. But why? And if the answer is, well, this standard tells me to do it, but we haven't seen a threat adversary sort of go after that sort of attack vector. We haven't seen the overall investment that would sort of say, yes, if you did this, you would reduce your risk by X percentage. Then why would you waste the money and the time and the resources and the overhead for that? When again, I could point to these 5 things like, hey, have you locked down secure remote access as part of that? And one of the reasons why that is in control by itself is because we've seen adversaries use that. And so when you bring in threat intelligence, when you have this active sort of cyber defense life cycle that you can bring in to understand your requirements, it makes a justification for them a lot easier than saying, oh, I have to do this because NERC tells me, or because TSA says I should do this. That gets you somewhere, but it doesn't give you to that culture. It doesn't get you to that continual cycle of improvement that you'll get if you use threat intelligence to drive and say, we're doing this because we've seen threat adversaries use this in our victimology, in our geography, in our industry, and therefore we should implement controls against that as well.
Last question I have for you. Where should I start with vulnerability management?
I think you need to understand your crown jewels first as a starting point. And really, because the vulnerability management can go down, and again, I come back to, I think I mentioned it before, this can become a really bad rabbit hole in a lot of cases. But understand what what's critical to you and what you think what you're going to do with the results of that vulnerability information. Are you prepared to patch? Are you prepared to any of the it's a matter of understanding the risk that comes out of that and applying it to the crown jewels of your organization. And I'm sure, Jason, you probably have more to add to that too, I'm sure.
I would just give one example as part of that. People remember shell shock, right? Like it had a logo and everything. Like that's when I knew vulnerability, like Heartbleed and shell shock, when you started getting logos for vulnerabilities. I'm like, oh wow, logos got like PR companies now. It's amazing. But shell shock, 10 out of 10, like a horrific thing. And when you go into the OT environment, there were some assets that you did have to be concerned with. But when I was seeing CISOs having discussions about, well, what about like the PLCs, or what about, these pieces of equipment, that some of them were like real-time operating systems that were not impacted by the vulnerability at all. And they had to come up with these briefings that went to the CISO, and the CISO then went to the board on why this wasn't really a vulnerability they had to be concerned with. And I think that using that example as one of the hallmarks, sort of the example that I'd post up about why it is for vulnerability management, we need to understand our assets better and know that OT is not IT. And once you could just get over that hump and start understanding that there are things that just won't be impacted by certain vulnerabilities, or even if they are, I have other mitigations in place that mean patch management's not a thing I need to worry about. Vulnerability management maybe other mitigations. And if you can embrace that, again, I'm thinking about that culture, that engineering side, the physics of it, then you can start having a better conversation around it, as opposed to, hey, I got a new patch from Microsoft, we're going to run it in all the plant environments. That won't go anywhere anytime soon.
Excellent. Well, Jason and Sam, I'm grateful for your time and your insights, and thanks for answering these questions as well.
Thank you very much.
Thanks
Tom.
for having us.
First, I want to thank our attendees. We know you took time out of your day to attend this session. We're grateful for that. And I do trust you're walking away with some excellent new insight and new data points regarding OT cybersecurity. I look forward to seeing you again at one of our upcoming sessions. Until then, for Information Security Media Group, I'm Tom Field. Thank you for your time and attention today.